Deep under the ocean, following the events of World War II, a city was built to escape all the rules and regulation of government. The world was being pushed and pulled by those who were elected, and as the common person and person with power lost more power to those in office, Andrew Ryan would attempt to escape the influence of law. First attempting to buy large tracts of land out in a forest, the government would come to him and say that they need to make it public and then turn it into a national park so everyone can enjoy it. And as recompense, he just burned it all down. What a douche. But this would be the push that he needed to descend down into the depths of the ocean to create Rapture, a literal city under the sea. Referred to as a city that was not impossible to build, but impossible to build anywhere else, things for a while would operate under the ideology of laissez-faire. There would be no government in which to rule over the people. Man or woman would come to the city to succeed or fail based on the sweat of their own brow. And therein lies the problem. Not everyone can succeed. Someone has to scrub the toilets. This would ultimately go on to create a power difference between many groups, but two in particular, Fontaine and Ryan. This would ultimately spell the undoing of Rapture, as the whole city would be plunged into a civil dispute that would destroy the city from the inside out. And when you have hundreds of thousands of pounds of pressure pushing down on you from above, that might not be the best thing in the world. So in today's episode, we are dipping our toes into the water that is Bioshock, and we'll be discussing where I believe that we need to start, the fall of Rapture brought on by the gene editing tool known as Adam. The first place that we should probably start is from the beginning. Andrew Ryan is the founder of Rapture. Possessing an idea that the market will regulate itself no matter what, he had Rapture built to escape the influences and laws of the governments on land. His idea was to attract the best and brightest down to Rapture along with himself and essentially have a mega city of production because there were no limits. Any idea a scientist or businessman or farmer had could be implemented without the moral obligations or ruling of a society. For a while, things were going pretty well. A hierarchy would inevitably still begin to develop as it always does, and moral failings of humanity would continue to grow as crime was still a thing. Security measures would have to be put into place, strip clubs were bustling, but everything was based on the almighty dollar. If you were caught actually breaking into a place, you could deactivate the security system if you had the cash. But the key was that there were really no laws or boundaries to speak of, short of harming others, but even then, it was up to the person to protect themselves. This all stemmed from Andrew Ryan's views of how he could not interfere with virtually anything and that the market would sort itself out. As more people entered the city, everyone came down there because they wanted to be great, to come up with the next idea that would propel themselves and humanity skywards. But as we all know, that simply isn't possible. Many of those who actually came down to the city were met with failure and being boxed out of markets simply because another person had a better idea than theirs, which would lead to a resentment, but also worsening conditions for themselves. Again, as stated, someone has to scrub the toilets. For reference, this would be something like Einstein and Stephen Hawking both showing up to the same place at the same time, and then one of them having to scrub the toilets while the other gets to come up with a theory of relativity. But eventually it would reach a point where those who were in complete dire need would be taken in by a man named Frank Fontaine. Fontaine would open up a poorhouse sector in the city, which took in adults and children alike. However, it was said that he was benevolent, but in reality, he was far from the case. Entering the poor section of the city, people were seen actually trying to escape from time to time, only to be massacred by security. The reality was it was more like a prison for the poor, more so than just a voluntary area of where to go. That said, a prison was more regulated. Fontaine's house for the poor was instead a nightmare of experiments with no ethical oversight. Prior to these experiments, however, there was an incident that seemed to suggest a new era of medical technology advancement was about to be ushered in. Down in Fontaine Fisheries, a dock worker was working with some fish and slugs they had collected off the sea floor. Having long had a crippled hand that was no longer functional, he inadvertently had one of the slugs bite his hand. After a while, however, the bite would go on to completely heal his hand and make it functional once more. This breakthrough was astounding, as medical technology up to this point had not achieved this. This caught the attention of Brigitte Tenenbaum, a German scientist working in Rapture at the same time. As she began working on the slug to reveal how it was able to do this, she discovered something that would be referred to as Adam. Adam was capable of influencing the genetic coding of humans, which we will be discussing how it was actually able to do this a little later on, but essentially she was able to bend the double helix to her will, which would have proven to be a complete game changer for her species, but because there was really no oversight into how it works or how it should be applied, it was founded in a very volatile environment. Over time, Dr. Tenenbaum was able to work out just exactly what was going on with the atom. It would take a human functional cell and essentially sidestep the mitotic pathway and then just revert it back to a stem cell. In controlled environments and under the right conditions, it would do things like heal the dock worker's hand, or it could alter a chronic illness in a person that they may be suffering by reverting the cell back to the start. In theory, this could have provided immortality. However, the one issue was the host's original tissue was destroyed in the process as the cell was reverted back to a stem cell, and this would cause Adam to be looked at as a form of benign cancer. As time progressed, eventually Dr. Tenenbaum's findings would come out, and others would begin to also conduct their own experiments for random purposes until eventually a plasmid would be formed. A plasmid was essentially the result of gene altering via Adam that would allow a person to be endowed with what would amount to be superpowers using the stem cells for exact purposes that were desirable to the user. This caused the plasmid business to explode, driving up the need for more Adam. The issue was, however, that the Adam was not easy to come by, and the slugs responsible for its creation did not create all that much on their own. Eventually, somehow, it was discovered that if you implanted the slug in the stomachs of female children, they would produce 20 to 30 times the amount of Adam that they would on their own. And this would lead to Dr. Tenenbaum and Fontaine treading down a fairly dark path. Utilizing the poor for their financial gain, Dr. Tenenbaum would subject the girls of Fontaine's poorhouse to the slugs, turning them into what was considered to be vegetables on life support by the slug-human interaction. It should also be noted, in some cases, children were actually straight up abducted, as if you go into the abandoned apartment of one part, you can actually find an audio log that tells you about how the mother and father found their kid who was turned into a little sister. But Fontaine would look on the process with disgust, but he saw the financial opportunity of continuing to work with Dr. Tenenbaum. As the production continued, this would only further grow the plasmid business until many different versions would arise, from fire creation to more durable bodies to telekinesis. The imagination of the person was really the only limit, utilizing these stem cells to produce whatever they wanted to. Eventually, however, due to the fact that Adam has some less than desirable effects on the body, as people continued to acquire more and more plasmids, they would become something akin to superhuman, but they would lose more and more of themselves in the process due to the reversion of their cells back to stem cells, which would create these new plasmids. Adam would turn into a full-blown addiction with quite possibly no minimum safe amount to be detected. Due to the natural instability of Adam and its effect on the genetic coding of a body, if a person went too long without more Adam, they would devolve into a chaotic, incoherent, and aggressive shell of their former selves. They would begin attacking family and friends, as well as just straight up ending people for their Adam. The entire city was infected, and with more Adam needed daily just to keep everyone sane, the demand would supersede the supply by a large amount. However, with all the bodies laying around, an idea was formed. If the children could produce Adam, they could also go out and secure the Adam as well. For every body that fell, a little sister was sent out to collect what they could for the Adam to be recycled back into the system. Eventually, as they were attacked more and more on their own, a new form of human was created, known as the Big Daddy, and that would protect the little sisters from these former humans, known as splicers. This recycling of Adam did have unintended consequences. Due to the fact that it did affect the genetic coding of a person, an imprint of that person's coding would also remain with the Adam in some instances, and this could translate into seeing things like ghostly apparitions of the former person who had their Adam recycled back into service, which we will talk about and why I think that's also possible, because it's actually more plausible than you might think. But even all of this was not enough to stem the coming battle. As people devolved further and further, it was sort of like a runaway effect. They needed more Adam to maintain their sanity, but the Adam was eroding them away further, which they would need more just to keep themselves going. Eventually, this would begin having severe physical manifestations on their bodies, or at least with those who were the heavy users. Bleeding from the eyes and nose and mouth, blindness, crystal formations on the skin, cutis laxa or loose skin, death, hair loss, hair patches, hallucinations, heterochromia iridium, which is basically just different color of the irises, hormone imbalances, insanity, insomnia, jaundice, lesions, memory loss, paranoia, rashes, shingles, spider veins, swollen gums, syndactyl or fusion of the middle finger and ring finger, or possible webbing within the hand, tooth loss, tumors, varicose veins, vitiligo, or really just changes in the skin color over time as the skin loses melanin. But this is just to name a few of the manifestations, but basically their genes were changing the more Adam they used, but they had to use more Adam to maintain the ability to think. This would ultimately spell the undoing of Rapture, as the city was plunged into chaos with splicers running amok, attacking everyone and everything for their Adam. Some chose to end it by shuffling off their mortal coil, while others chose to side with Andrew Ryan, who had Adam to fight for Rapture, while even others chose to side with Fontaine, who also had Adam at his disposal, which ended up causing a civil war to break out amongst the two groups, with a lot of people caught in the crosshairs. Eventually, however, Adam would run out. Due to the fighting, production of new Atoms stopped, and it began to be concentrated in just a few. Because of the memories of others in the Adam, hallucinations became more and more common as bodies were harvested, and what they had witnessed scientists were imprinted on their genes, which was then passed along to others, further driving up the insanity factor, until eventually most of the city was destroyed or had gone dark. The only thing left at this point were splicers or a few top scientists or those protected by barriers that they had put up to stop the fight from entering their home, such as Fontaine or Ryan. At this point, this is where the plane goes down, leading to the events of Bioshock 1. So the best place to kick this thing off would be discussing what Adam actually is, what it does to the body, and why the hallucinations might actually be more common than you think based on genetic coding for a few reasons. Adam itself, as discussed, is a gene manipulation tool. Having bitten the hand of the dock worker, we can get an idea on the pathway that it actually took to repair his hand. While not explicitly told to us what sort of injury he had or in what state his hand was in, we do know that Adam works as a stem cell producer. But what's most interesting is it doesn't create stem cells from nothing. Instead, it takes existing cells and then turns them into this stem cell. In a localized amount, this is how it healed his hand. We know right now, actually like in real life, stem cells may pave the way in the future for fixing issues such as paralysis because stem cells are highly suggestible cells when placed around templates. They are basically your own cells, and when placed near each other, or say near developed cells, those stem cells will actually become those developed cells. Also, don't take a shot every time I say cells because you might literally need to go to the hospital. Good Lord, I wrote this in a lot. Anyways, they are undifferentiated, meaning that they could be a muscle cell or an epithelial cell or a nerve cell. Really, any cell you need, they can become if placed around. The reason for this is, which a lot of people might not think about, is all of our cells have the same genes except for the sex cells, which undergo meiosis as opposed to mitosis. When you become you at fertilization, your cells begin dividing via a process known as mitosis. The goal of mitosis is to completely copy the genetic coding of the original cell, which then splits and creates two daughter cells. Then that DNA is copied, taken, and split, which then creates 4 daughter cells, and then 8, and then 16, and then 32, and so on and so forth until you are born. All your cells at that point in time have the same genetic coding, but certain genes will be activated, which will cause the cells to differentiate. Nerve cells, bone cells, epithelial cells, blood cells, immune cells all stem from the same cell, the combination of the sperm and egg. Going back to Adam, that is what it does to your cell. It reverts it back into being a stem cell, but you lose that differentiation in the process. This means that over time, using more and more and in non-localized areas, the atom can spread into the body, turning more cells into stem cells. However, localized, it was a miracle. Biting the dock worker would have likely caused the immediate epithelial and muscle tissue surrounding the potentially damaged nerves to become these stem cells. Those close enough to the damaged nerve would have completed the connection, whereas those further away likely became muscle tissue once more. This allowed for his hand to heal and be movable once more despite the grievous wounds that he suffered previously. Moving on, I mean, that sounds fantastic, doesn't it? A body becoming stem cells in certain areas likely has the ability to heal a lot higher than the body does naturally or what it is capable of. However, the issues begin to happen when you begin having like pockets of stem cells spread across the body and in critical areas such as with the brain of a person. So imagine it this way, it's sort of like the tide eroding a coastline. As the tide comes in, it will take away just a little bit of dirt, rock, and sand. And this is like as more atom is taken into the body, the immediate outer area of the body that you are trying to impact would become stem cells. As this happens more and more, eventually the line moves further and further back into what you essentially are until finally that line has moved so far back, it's into the critical components such as the brain. The issue began to arise when programmable plasmids utilizing atom were aimed at things like telekinesis, or at least this is my hypothesis on when these things started to become really bad. When a neuron was forced to become a stem cell, those particular connections were lost, and even if it went back to being a neuron, there's no guarantee that the same connections would be made in that configuration once more, which means at first, likely there wouldn't have been too much of an impact if only done like once or twice, but it would still change the way the brain works, which again, something as simple as breaking a bad habit that you may be having right now can actually change the connections in the brain due to neuroplasticity, meaning that your brain isn't static anyhow. But if you keep doing it over and over and over again, eventually these lost and reformed connections would be too much. So the issue arises when large swaths of the brain begin to be changed at levels that the original consciousness cannot compensate for. And considering we don't really have too much of a grasp on what consciousness is apart from the patterns firing in the brain, this apparent delicate balance would plague the person as their addiction to atom would cause them to use more and more to satiate their desire. As the brain changes and the patterns are consistently altered, there may have actually been some bleed over not accounted for too. Things like blood vessels within the brain itself may have changed the newly made neural stem cells into blood vessels. The meninges may have dipped deeper into the cerebrum as there was, as I said, bleed over from those stem cells being changed, or in general, the structuring and connection of the brain would have changed so much, logical thought would no longer be possible. And this would lead to things like the splicers exhibiting mental deficits, which we have seen. But what's interesting about this addiction level is it doesn't appear to be driven by the usual suspects. There is really no apparent high gotten from using Adam, apart from the feeling of power, or at least nothing that we have seen. This would indicate to me that a particular portion of the brain begins to experience the effects of Adam as the hardest of the usage continues. Within the brain, the area known as the reward system is the nucleus accumbens. Here is really kind of the good feelings associated with doing something that we enjoy, or maybe even doing something that is detrimental to us but feels good regardless, and this is what rewards the brain. What I think is happening is that Adam changes the neurons near here, and it's possible that they too become reward cells, which in turn might cause a person to seek out more reward as they get bigger and bigger hits each time. So we're about to tread back into the realm of possibilities of the human brain in real life, but right near this reward system of the brain is something known as mirror neurons. In some ways, these have been hypothesized to help us understand the intentions of others before we even know it, as we can see like micro expressions and micro movements in their body. It's basically really good at reading body language when you can't read what a person wants. So that's why if you ever have like a gut instinct that you just don't like somebody, it really could be that your mirror neurons are picking up intentions from them that they can't hide and you can't see. So pretty interesting. But in other ways, it's been suggested that this can actually supposedly help us read minds. Now, I'm not saying that's what it does. I'm more on the micro movement and micro expression train, but that's just me. But it's very strange, mainly because they have done some studies on these group of cells that might suggest that this could be the next stage in human evolution. But the idea of telekinesis has always been linked to something like mind reading to a degree, which may be why those who could have really chosen this particular plasmid may have been altered in this way concerning reward, as this portion of the brain was targeted. So to wrap up everything I just said, as it turns out, the reward center is really close to the mirror neurons, and mirror neurons have been associated with telekinesis, at least in popular culture. So those being close to each other, the reward system bleeds over. But Adam in itself has some strange impacts on the brain, regardless of how much is used. It was discovered not too long after that Adam could be programmed with extra coding that would create the actual plasmids. And I love how they use plasmids because I actually used to work with those in bacteria to determine antibiotic resistance through tests like polymerase chain reactions. It was really a blast. It's really pretty cool to see how like bacteria could pick up plasmids from other bacteria to become resistant to things that they might not have been just a few generations back. But much like how plasmids are a circular set of DNA within prokaryotes that help the cell develop resistance among other things, these encoded plasmids would direct the stem cell to become things that they never were, such as the ability to create fire or a swarm of insects or freeze people. Now, some of those are obviously a little out there concerning abilities, but it is a video game, so there's going to be some things that probably aren't exactly in line with life. But again, it wasn't too long after recycling Adam that people started to hallucinate what others have seen. But the question is, why? Well, did you know that witnessing something horrendous can actually have imprinted on your DNA? Hardships in life may physically manifest within the literal genetic coding of the body in some instances. Now, that is not to say that it would be like a snapshot of a memory, but considering what Adam does, I can definitely see a person witnessing something terrible, then those particular set of neurons associated with that memory form a similar complex within the brain of an individual who may not have actually seen that or even known that person, but it would cause them to momentarily see what they saw if there was, say, a structure or environment that triggered that set of memories to come to the surface. This idea is supported by the fact that utilizing Adam means you can quite literally implant the memories that don't exist inside the head of a person, so the memories that have existed inside the head of a person would be transferable to another person. But concerning Jack, using this same method of having someone remember a family member or think back to their childhood, they were able to use this genetic coding and structure of neurons to isolate a literal memory to create that structuring of neural connections within Jack's brain case to have him falsely remember having a life. But the thing to remember about Adam is it is still referred to as a benign cancer. Cancer cells exist for their own purpose, and when it's in small amounts or incredibly slow growing, there are really no immediate consequences, and you really shouldn't worry too much, which is is exactly what Adam is, or really was at the beginning. But the issue is, however, due to no regulation or any real studies being done on the effects of Adam on the human body, because people were just trying to get it out to market as quickly as possible, likely the safe barrier was decimated and surpassed long before the problems arose. It is possible that enough time must pass before jumping to, like, say, the next plasmid to allow the body to reacclimate to the new structuring, but as people used it more and more and faster, their bodies would go on to basically lose the plot. We see those that took too much too fast are not only mentally altered, but physically altered as well. It would appear as though Adam works its way into your body, but will still affect the outside of your body as well, more so because it's injected into the veins of a person. But once it begins manifesting on the outside of your body, we begin to see this cancerous growth, which aren't necessarily out of control, but because the stem cells are that for a short while, this leads to growths in the body themselves that are not necessarily supposed to be there. Getting a good look at splicers, we can see that depending on how they attempted to influence their genetic coding, this would have profound impact on their physiology, with things like loose skin and lips, covered eyes by cancerous mounds, or in general, hair loss afflicting most of them, with patchy skin being seen throughout. Much of the brain is affected at this point too, so obviously we would also see these effects on the outside of the body. But with all that said, I think I want to save the splicer variants for a more in-depth analysis a little later on down the road. Adam at its core has the ability to completely change humanity's fate concerning injuries and illness. However, without the proper tests and studies done, the miracle drug that could help the Homo sapiens race achieve immortality was rushed and corrupted to the point that it would bastardize the human genetic coding, resulting in what would essentially amount to monsters roaming the streets and hallways of Rapture. So remember, kids, dare to be Adam free, because that worked so well in our universe, didn't it? Get it? It's like dare to be drug free. Okay.